Do you agree that Adam and Eve are the first actual human beings, or symbols of a group of the first ones as John interprets it, who possessed all the cognitive and moral spiritual faculties necessary for knowing God, who evolved, as you say, 100,000 or so years ago and lived in harmony with God in the beatific Garden of Eden for an unknown amount of time and, through their own free will, rejected God for the idolization of the self, resulting in the catastrophic fall? If you're able to stay with us through the end of that single sentence, or that single question, which rivals St. Paul for the longest question, I think, ever, let's break this down into what this person's trying to say. Depending on how you read this, this could either be a skeptical question, or this could be a genuine sort of precision question. Are Adam and Eve real people? Or at least are they real in the sense that they are depicting something true about the origins of humanity, at least within their moral faculties? Now, the thing is that if you take the position of the literal six-day creation, this is a relatively straightforward answer. The thing is, though, is that when we take Polkinghorne's position, when we take the position of humanity as being something that emerges from creation, to try to square what Polkinghorne and Beale have said about both evolutionary biology and the geologic dating of Earth, the question that you run into is, okay, well, what do we do with Adam and Eve then? Because at least from the moral and spiritual perspective, Adam and Eve are significantly important in the Genesis story, because we don't get the fall of humanity, the story of the fall, without Adam and Eve, and particularly without the temptation in the garden. And in that particular story, we are given, within the context of the first 3 chapters of Genesis, a relatively robust vision of what it means to be human. Because this is a central thing about the Jewish Christian tradition that differentiates the Jewish and Christian tradition from other traditions. The different religions that don't have this sort of creation story, it's easy for us in the West to just assume that, God created the heavens and the earth, God created humanity, but key in all of this is that God created humanity very good. And even one commentator has noted, John Baer of the Eastern Orthodox tradition has noted that there's even a language change in the creation story between the rest of creation and humanity. John Baer notes that in the Septuagint Greek, you have a change of language between God says, let us create, let us create, let us create. And then he says, when he gets to humanity, he says, let us make someone. So there's a difference between we're creating something, but then there's a difference in language when we get to humanity. Let us make man in our image. Let us make humanity. And so there is a significant shift when we get to humanity, because we're dealing with maybe not different material, but we're dealing with a different type of being when we get to that story in Genesis. And if we look at it, it's the only instance in the Genesis account in which God says, and in which the scriptures say, that humanity is made in the image of God. That's a significant statement, especially for an ancient Near Eastern people in which incarnate deities were almost always kings, pharaohs, or otherwise. There were people who were made in the image of God, and those people made in the image of God were only one person at a time. If you remember in the Acts of the Apostles, King Herod, when he was arrayed in all of his glory, the people were chanting the voice of a god and not of a man. It's the same sort of thing. It's recognizing the important people as made in the image of God, but in the scriptures, in the Old Testament Genesis account, we're kind of strikingly told, no, all of humanity is made in the image of God. Something that I don't think we take as seriously sometimes because we've heard it so much, but a radical thing to say for the ancient Near East, and still something radical for us to say even today. But the preamble to this is, when we talk about human beings, how did we get the moral spiritual faculties that we see pretty clearly within the choice of Adam and Eve to disobey the commandment of God in the garden? And how do we say that these were real people? And if we take that the origins of humanity and all of its species and all of its hominid species occurs 100,000 years ago, how are we to say, or in what ways do we say, that Adam and Eve are real? Well, this is a good question. Number one, we just don't know. We really don't have the ability to be there as if we were in history. This is the challenge of archaeology and historical study, is that we piece together evidence of the ancient past, but we cannot observe it directly. This is why the science of paleontology is also an art in a lot of ways. You are doing scientific study, this is true, but whenever you bridge into the history telling, the putting together of the pieces of evidence to form a historical story, that's where the art of history comes in, where we're not able to observe history as it happens in the past. I'm not able to go back to what I had for breakfast yesterday and observe exactly what happens in that time. It's the past. I can absolutely find evidence of what I had for breakfast yesterday, but I cannot go back in time. I don't have a time machine, and as far as I know, we don't have access to that technology at this moment. But the question of Adam and Eve as real people, on the one hand, this is simply what the scriptures attest to. And this is the story of the creation of the world. Now, we can also say that there is a significant amount of poetry that goes on in the Genesis account. Genesis 1 is a giant piece of poetry. And you'll see Hebrew scholars, especially of the Jewish tradition, point this out all the time. Genesis 1 is a big oral tradition piece of poetry. It's parallelisms. And it's also parallelisms in a very particular order called a chiasm in Genesis chapter 1. In Genesis chapter 2, the order of creation is slightly different. It's not substantially different, but it is different enough for us to say there are two different creation accounts in Genesis, and that kind of tells us we can treat perhaps the minute details with a little less rigidity, and instead we need to talk about the overarching theme. And really the overarching theme of the Genesis account is God made the world good, God made humanity very good, and in some mysterious way, shape, or form, God made humanity in his image. And that is a deep and complex mystery that we are still working out today. What does it mean to be created in the image of God? Genesis 1:26 through 27 says that humans are created in the image of God. What does this mean? Judaism and Christianity have spilled hundreds of pounds of ink over thousands of years speaking about what it means to be created in the image of God. The kind of key phrase here is that we are created in the image and likeness. We are not created exactly like God, but we are after God's image and likeness. In the same sort of way that a craftsman or a painter paints a picture, creates a piece of furniture, that furniture and that painting is reflective of the author's processes, thoughts, expression. But of course, we don't identify the art with the author. It's not the same thing. It is a shadow of that cannot exist without the author. But likewise, it is not nearly as complex a sort of thing as God creating humanity with rationality. It's far more akin, perhaps, to use the metaphor of children and parents. the parent and the child are really deeply, deeply intertwined with each other. The child is a reflection of the image and likeness of the parent, both in the genetic sense and also in the behavioral sense. But at the same time, they are not exactly the same thing. The child can make moral choices apart from what the parent's will is. And the parent is caring for the child in the best possible sense, regardless of the moral character of that child, even in the most extreme sense. So maybe closer to say that, but still that's not a perfect reaching to this, because it's more fundamental than that. God, who is not like us, who is not made of physical stuff of the universe, who is not made of the furniture of the stuff that I can touch necessarily, has created all that we see and us, and specifically humanity after his likeness and image. So what does that mean? Well, Nicholas Beale and John Polkinghorne want to give you 8 different things about what that means. And you can read them in the book, but generally what is following these lines of traditional Christian theology is that humans are intrinsically, indelibly made in the image of God. It's not something that we simply say some people are and some people aren't. Okay, again, using the previous example of, the Pharaoh is an incarnate God, but us lowly, peasants are nowhere near that image. In the Genesis account, there is no distinction between king and pauper. The thing is that every single person that we encounter is bearing the image of God and is worthy of respect and dignity in and of themselves, not by anything they do, but by their own being they are due that. This is key as it comes to Christian ethics. Every single person is due respect and dignity because of this truth that we hold theologically. So that's fundamental in the way that we view other people, but also in the ethics that we treat other people in. But some of the other things that also are included within that is, if we were made after the image and likeness of God, that means that in some way, shape, or form, we are like God in certain fashions. To put it this way, we are given, let's say, creativity. We are given the ability to use the language of Polkinghorne and Beale, to arrange the things of the universe, or to order the things in the universe in such a way as to create systems, to rationally examine things, to, let's say, understand the way that the world functions. And not only to understand, not only to arrange, but also to take delight in that. It is delightful to be able to see, interact, and be a part of the physical universe. And we kind of get that sense in our sense of beauty. There is an indelible sense that we are, in a lot of ways, drawn towards the beautiful, and we're also drawn to create the beautiful. And that goes for any occupation, for any person in any walk of life. This goes for painters as well as for mechanics. There is a order, a beauty to the universe that is indelible and that we are drawn towards. And again, the beauty of the universe being made after the image of her creator. That humans are beautiful. They are things of which speak to the beauty of the creator. At least in types and shadows, perhaps. So there is that. But also a key thing for us in the Christian tradition is that whenever God is saying, let us make, Christians have interpreted that as this is an act of Trinity. This is an act of the Godhead, of the Trinity of persons and unity of being, of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This is a beautiful interaction between a community, to use that particular word, the communitas of God, in making something both in the singular action of God as one substance, but of the Trinity as 3 personae, or 3 hypostases. The idea of these different persons that are alive and are completely one with each other, such that we believe in one God who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And likewise, humans were also not created outside of community. In the Genesis account, it is particularly focusing on the fact that it is not good for man to be alone. This idea that humanity is not meant to be by themselves. And just as a note here, this idea that only a small portion, that's really an English and Latin translation problem. The Hebrew is that we're taking a half of a human and we are making a community of persons here. And so the reality of humans being made communal creatures is indelible in their own creation. They are made by a community of persons, so to speak, in the Trinity, and they are also made in community with other persons. And so the social aspect of humans is not only something that we see that is simply a fact about humanity, but it is a created good of humanity. It is not good for us to be alone. We have to be together in this. Deep, important things about that. But to also note, all of these things together speak to personhood of the human is something that is multifaceted. Because, again, if everyone is created in the image of God, that means that just because we have different rational functioning does not make us any more or less human. And this is extremely important as it comes to really the human rights revolution within the past 100 years, which was largely based off of this theology. And so when we talk about those for whom have particular mental faculties that are different than ours, such as those on the autism spectrum or the Asperger spectrum, such as those who are Down syndrome and things like that, just because they have different ways of mental processing or different ways of rationally functioning doesn't make them any less human than anyone else is. And so the thing is that humanity is not a one-size-fits-all thing, even though it is a truly hominid thing. The sort of base thing about human beings that perhaps we can kind of delve down into really is the function of the rational will. Being able to make decisions, and not simply instinctual decisions such as, hunting for food or things like that, but actual rational reflective decisions about myself, about the world around me, about meaning of life, things like that. And so when it comes to what does it mean to be made in the image of God, it means all of those things all together at once in a lot of kind of mysterious depths that we still haven't plumbed the depths of. And this, again, becomes really important when we think about humanity as made in the image of God, regardless of which human we're talking about. I heard Dr. Polkinghorne speak today. After the lecture, he allowed a few questions. One had to do with the morality of embryonic stem cell research. Dr. Polkinghorne answered by discussing at what point an embryo becomes a human person, at 14 days, I think. I would like to ask how the love principle that God created a universe that allows beings to be and make themselves would address this issue. If the potential for human life exists in the embryo before 14 days, should love allow it to become? I think Nicholas Beale and Polkinghorne put this correctly when they preface the answer to this question by saying, this is a deeply complex issue. The role of human development in personhood is one that is significantly complex, one that there's not an easy answer to, but one of which in the Christian tradition we have some general principles that we have to at least be beholden to whenever we discuss when someone becomes a person. Now, we need to start at the base here. So, personhood is a philosophical category. It is really, in a lot of ways, to be able to act with a will and be able to act as what we would call an agent. I've used that word a lot in this class, but just as a reminder, an agent is a person that has a rational will, a person that can make moral decisions can reflect upon one's own meaning and being, and be able to make, based upon an observation of the world and based upon their internal rationality, decisions outside of mere instinctual decisions. So it's not merely that I am hungry and need food. Cats get hungry and need food. But in the way that I get hungry and need food, I reflect on the meaning of why I'm feeling that. It's not merely that I then look for the closest thing that's food around me, like a cat would, like my cats do. They look for the closest thing that's food around them. I reflect on something deeper than that. When I'm hungry for food, I have a couple of things that I can reflect on. Why am I hungry right now? I haven't had food within the past little bit. I've reflected on that particular being and state. But also, I can reflect on what kind of food would be good for me to seek out. It's not that I find the nearest thing to put in my mouth, like my cats find the cheese that goes into their bodies and then they throw it up because they just can't process the cheese that they just ate. But the question of me choosing what to have for lunch, that is a reflective aspect of rationality. I can choose to have the cheeseburger from downtown, or I can choose to go home and have the sandwich that I have in the refrigerator. Or I could make some other decision than that. That is the free ability to exercise my rationality as an agent, as a person. But when we're talking about embryonic development, this becomes really, really crucial because we have some dueling philosophies that we are having crash into each other, particularly around the question of embryonic stem cell research, around the debate around abortion, and around the debates around what exactly constitutes someone who has a rationality. Again, this was a live question in about 100 years ago, whenever we saw, from an arguable scientific perspective, again, using science to aid this perspective, that some people were less rational than others. That is still a haunting subject for those of whom prize the sciences highly. There was this practice called eugenics within the late 1800s, early 1900s, in which we were trying to, at least after the evolutionary perspective of the survival of the fittest, we were trying to socially engineer a perfect people out of that. And if that sounds like Nazism, that is exactly what that is. So this particular question is one that both has some guardrails around it of the diversity of human beings. Again, human beings are made in the image of God no matter who they are or where they're at, which is what the Genesis account tells us. But also, when is the point at which a person becomes a person? So, let's talk about those philosophies. There is one philosophy that says that at the actual meeting of the sperm with the egg, that is the point at which a human is made. And at that point is where the embryonic process begins to develop into a human being. At this point is when it happens. And there's a lot of things that kind of go along with support for this particular argument. Because from a genetic perspective, it really is a different sort of genetic being than the mother or the father. It is a combination of the DNA. You have your RNA strands that come together, and they actually do create a different set of DNA. And so the thing is that we cannot say that this is necessarily, by necessity, the exact same thing as either the father or the mother, from a bare genetic perspective. And so there is something to be said for this is a distinct biological thing that's going on right here. On the other hand, the question of whether this particular creation, this particular biological being, has a will or not is something that is nigh impossible to understand. Do we say that one has a rational will in the womb? This is something that in the stages of development, we could make some different arguments as we get later in the stages. We'll come back to that in just a moment. But this particular philosophy that we're talking about is basically when sperm meets egg, that is when a rational human agent is made. And that this rational human agent is a real person. And that this real person, in this sense, is going to develop in the perfect process into a human being. Another particular question of this particular happening is, there are all kinds of instances in which even the earliest meeting of this particular sperm and egg becomes unviable within days. The question of whether this particular combination of DNA, this particular biological thing, actually had agency is really something that we don't have any access to, because we can't ever get inside the mind or the soul of, or if there is one, of this particular creation. So this is something that perhaps is unknowable. But the other kind of counterbalance to this is that we do have scriptural passages that speak to even before one comes out of the womb, that God knows us. Before I was even born, you knit me together in my mother's womb, says the psalmist. So we have a very high view of life, even life that has not been born yet. So that's the first philosophy. This is when it happens. Now, you have another philosophy within Christianity, which is that there is a process of agency that happens. In other words, it's not necessarily that when this meets this, that all of a sudden we have someone who has a rationality. Thomas Aquinas, even though Aquinas himself would say that when this happens, this is something teleologically, and this word teleologically means goal-orientedly. As soon as this happens, there will be, in the perfect processes of this particular biological function, a human being on the end of this spectrum. It's the same sort of thing as saying that when I take an oak seed and I plant it in the earth, that on the other side of that developmental spectrum is an oak tree. Whenever the seed is planted into the ground, within the first, 3, 4, 5 days, you might have a shoot pop up that comes out of the little seed right here, right? But in no way, shape, or form would we ever say that that's an oak tree. We would say that that is, let's say, a sapling or a sprout or something that is distinct from an actual oak tree. There is a developmental process in which there is certainly, absolutely a goal-orientedness. In the end, this will become an oak tree, but there's a process by which we move from seed to sprout to sapling to actual tree. So Aquinas is going to say something similar about human development. In his own way, he follows Aristotle's distinctions as to how things become human. And this is something that is sometimes called a process called ensoulment. This particular process of ensoulment, it's not necessarily that you get a soul stuffed in you. Rather, in Aristotle's philosophy, everything has souls. It's just that we have different kinds of souls, and souls in the way that Aristotle uses them is simply the thing that makes a thing that thing. So a plant has a soul. It has a plant soul. An animal has a soul. It has an animal soul. I, as a human, have a rational soul, which is what differentiates me from the animal and the animal from the plant. So that's what Aristotle's trying to say here. In Aquinas' philosophy that we bring forward into the Roman Catholic spectrum, we can say that when sperm meets egg, absolutely, this is a human being. But we can say that there is a process of rationality and ensoulment that doesn't occur right at the beginning, but rather is a process over the long term. So, as it comes to the process of this process sort of function and understanding, it attempts to solve the problem of the first philosophy, which is that if right when this happens we have an agent. Well, the question is, well, how can I tell that that's an agent? Something that has a free will and a rationality if I can never observe it? Well, the thing is that because of ultrasounds and because of the incredible medical advancements that we can actually have some very clear views, a lot of data around the process of development within the womb. And what Polkinghorne points to is that in recent developments, what we can absolutely say is that certainly life begins at that moment because it's a biologically distinct thing. Rationality, however, is something that we can observe being a developmental process. And so, as it comes to the viability of, he would say, stem cell research and things like that, that is a question that I believe is open to a lot of spirited debate. But the question about when does a person become a person is a lot more evidence has been provided in recent years around that. For example, in the developmental cycle of an unborn fetus, you have the developmental process of the dividing cells from cells, and you have a process that is beginning to really give rise to a human being. However, we also know from studies that there is evidence to support that the child within the womb can recognize familiar voices. There is the evidence that points towards that even as early as when the heartbeat begins, we have some sort of rationality, at least within the animal sense, within the instinctual sense. So, in other words, it's not merely that this is just like another vital organ that is having some sort of function that is serving the wider system, but rather that there is something distinct from the mother and distinct from the father that is developing in some way. Again, this is where Aristotle's idea of we go through an ensoulment, we go through a process of plant, animal, and then human ensoulment. This is where perhaps there is at least some conceptual credence to that. But when does someone become a human being? Well, if we say that every human is made in the image of God, if we say that humanity, even in the womb, is something of which God has access and has interaction with, and if we, upon a body of evidence that has been yielded to us because of medical advancements, that we can say there seems to be some functional rationality very early on, that there is a concept that there is some recognition. So, in other words, not simply an animal needing of sustenance, but there is a reflective process in which I am recognizing a voice of someone, and that I am recognizing that person's voice even while inside the womb. That this body of evidence is pointing towards that the ensoulment process, or to use Aquinas' process, is the developmental process is something that at least occurs very early on, and in the best sense is that teleological arc that will end with a human being being born. The challenge to this is, if we have an unviable fetus, which of course is a tragedy no matter who you are, the question is that a person or not? Well, I think that there's a significant amount of not only confusion, but also of different philosophies crashing against each other. Is a human only someone who does something utilitarian? Well, we as Christians are not mere utilitarians. And again, going back to every human is made in the image and likeness of God, regardless of their capacity to do certain things. Just because my friend who is wheelchair bound cannot walk the same that I am, we would in no way say that they are any less human. So we have to be extremely sensitive to that particular issue. But the other part of this is that if we have, let's say, the example of someone who is, let's say, by the medical examples, non-viable, so to speak, and yet this person becomes viable, there is still a significant amount of things that we in the scientific community simply still don't know about the process of development, and really that there's a built-in unpredictability as to whether someone is viable or not. There are very unfortunate stories of perfectly healthy development that all of a sudden ends abruptly. And there are also stories of development that is really, really dicey, that turns out to be someone who goes on to live for many years of their life. Right now, I even have a couple of friends who had a baby extremely preterm, but because of medical advancements, that preterm delivery was not non-viable. It's simply that they are way, 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 way early in the developmental process and simply have not reached the point of being able to breathe on their own, to function on their own, and now we have to kind of walk through that developmental process exterior to the mother rather than interior. So do we say that that's a person or not? Well, the thing is that if we see that as rational functioning, and if we see that in the Genesis sense of every single human is created in the image of God, we as Christians, in a lot of ways, are pushed towards a very, very high view of any human life whatsoever, regardless of whether we can necessarily witness rationality in the sense of reflective rationality in it. We have to, in some ways, hold our hands up to this is something that we, in a lot of ways, have to behold by faith and have to treat extremely carefully in the grand scheme of things.